In 1834, a young enslaved woman named Hannah lost a set of keys. For this, she was beaten to death. Her killer was not some anonymous overseer on a distant plantation. He was a decorated United States Army officer, a man who would go on to become one of the most celebrated military figures of his era. His name was William Selby Harney, and what happened to Hannah was just the beginning. To understand how a man could beat an enslaved woman to death, escape justice, and then rise to become a general in the United States Army, we need to go back to the beginning. William Selby Harney was born on August 22, 1800, in a small community called Haysboro, just a few miles from Nashville, Tennessee, along the Cumberland River. His father, Thomas Harney, had been an Army officer himself, and the family occupied a comfortable position in Tennessee society. Young William attended a local private academy, receiving the kind of education that marked him as a gentleman in the eyes of his community. But from an early age, there were signs that William Harney possessed a volatile temperament, a capacity for violence that would define his entire career. The Harney family had connections, and those connections would prove decisive in shaping William's future. His older brother, Benjamin F. Harney, became an Army surgeon stationed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In 1817, when William was just 17 years old, Benjamin reached out to none other than Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812 and the current commander of the Army of the South. Jackson agreed to write a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, recommending young William for service. The letter worked. On July 23, 1817, William Harney received a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Navy, signed by President James Monroe himself. But Harney had no interest in the Navy. The sea held no appeal for him. Instead, he chose to serve under Andrew Jackson in the Army, beginning a military career that would span nearly half a century. His first assignment, in 1818, was as a second lieutenant in the 1st United States Infantry. One of his early tasks was helping to force the pirate Jean Lafitte to move his operations from Louisiana Territory to the Spanish Main. It was unglamorous work, but it introduced Harney to the realities of frontier military service and to the kind of men who thrived in such environments. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, Harney slowly climbed the ranks, participating in various frontier operations and gaining experience in the brutal style of warfare that characterized American expansion. In 1825, he accompanied Colonel Henry Atkinson and Benjamin O'Fallon on an expedition to sign treaties with Native American tribes along the Missouri River, his first significant interaction with the indigenous peoples whose lands the United States was systematically claiming. This expedition introduced Harney to the complex dynamics of frontier diplomacy, though his later career would demonstrate that he preferred force to negotiation. In 1832, Harney served in the Black Hawk War, a conflict that pitted the United States Army against the Sauk and Fox tribes who resisted removal from their ancestral lands in Illinois and Wisconsin. The war was brief but brutal, ending with the Bad Axe Massacre, in which American forces killed hundreds of Sauk and Fox men, women, and children as they attempted to cross the Mississippi River. During this campaign, Harney served as an assistant to General Zachary Taylor, and he formed a friendship with another young officer named Jefferson Davis, who would later become President of the Confederate States of America. The Black Hawk War taught Harney lessons about the use of overwhelming force against indigenous peoples, lessons he would apply with devastating effect in later decades. It was also during this period that Harney developed a reputation among Native American tribes for his physical prowess. The Crow people gave him the name Man Who Runs Like the Deer, after he challenged them to foot races outside the walls of a frontier fort. Harney was tall, powerfully built, and possessed of seemingly boundless energy. He could be charming when he chose to be, and he had a gift for impressing his superiors. But beneath the surface charm lay a capacity for sudden, explosive violence that would reveal itself again and again throughout his career. By 1834, Harney had risen to the rank of major in the Paymaster Corps, stationed at Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri. He had also married into one of the wealthiest and most prominent families west of the Mississippi River. His wife, Mary Mullenphy, was the daughter of John Mullenphy, an Irish immigrant who had amassed an enormous fortune in real estate and was considered by many to be the richest man in the region. The marriage took place on October 1st, 1833, just a month after John Mullenphy's death, and it brought Harney into the upper echelons of St. Louis society. It also brought him into possession of enslaved human beings. Among the people the Harneys acquired from the Mullenphy estate was a young enslaved woman named Hannah, along with her small child. Hannah would have been a familiar presence to Mary Harney, having lived and worked in the Mullenphy family home. John Mullenphy himself had been a complex figure, an Irish immigrant who had written a remarkable will that provided money to Catholic orders for educating orphans, and specified that money left to his daughters was for their sole and separate use, apart from and uncontrolled by their respective husbands. He had even made provisions for specific enslaved people in his will. But whatever protections or considerations Mullenphy might have extended to Hannah during his lifetime ended with his death. To the Harneys she was property, a piece of human chattel to be used as they saw fit. And in June of 1834, just a few months after Hannah joined the household, William Harney would demonstrate exactly what that meant. The incident took place at the elegant St. Louis mansion of Harney's sister-in-law. According to one historical account, Hannah had previously belonged to the Mullenphy household, and Mary Harney would have known her well. The killing occurred in the heart of one of St. Louis's most prominent families, in a house that represented the pinnacle of frontier prosperity. This was not violence hidden away on some remote plantation. This was violence in the parlors of polite society. The incident began with a set of lost keys. The keys to Harney's office went missing, and Harney suspected Hannah of taking them. What happened next was recorded by coroners, newspapers, and court documents. On April 26, 1834, the 33-year-old Major William S. Harney attacked Hannah. In a fit of rage, Harney grabbed a piece of rawhide, a leather strap that cost perhaps 25 cents, and he began to beat her. He beat her savagely, demanding to know where the keys were. He beat her until she told him where the keys were, or until she could no longer speak. He beat her until she could no longer stand. And then, 3 days later, Hannah died from her injuries. She was a young mother, and she left behind a small child who would grow up without her. On June 30th, 1834, the Missouri Republican newspaper reported that an inquest had been held at the dwelling house of Major Harney on the body of Hannah. The coroner ruled that Hannah had come to her death by wounds inflicted by William S. Harney. The Cincinnati Journal called Harney a monster. Even in St. Louis, a city where slavery was an accepted part of daily life, where enslaved people were bought and sold openly in the streets, the killing of Hannah provoked outrage. A mob formed, demanding justice. The county prosecutor promised to pursue the case. Harney's response was to flee. He headed east along the Ohio River, eventually reaching Wheeling, Virginia, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of his crime. He sought a transfer to another state, trying to escape not just the legal consequences but the social fallout of what he had done. But Harney had powerful friends and wealthy in-laws, and they worked behind the scenes to protect him. In July 1834, a grand jury indicted William S. Harney for murder. This was an extraordinary development. Slaveholders in Missouri, as in other slave states, held near absolute power over the people they enslaved. The law treated enslaved people as property, not persons, and owners could discipline their human property with virtually no legal restrictions. For a slaveholder to be charged with murder for killing an enslaved person was almost unheard of. It spoke to the sheer brutality of what Harney had done, the public nature of Hannah's death, and the revulsion it provoked even among people who accepted slavery as a normal institution. But the wheels of justice turned slowly, and they turned in Harney's favor. The ICE trial was moved out of St. Louis, away from the angry crowds and the witnesses who had seen Hannah's broken body. It was transferred to Union, Missouri, a small town about 50 miles away, where pro-slavery sentiment ran even deeper. The judge assigned to the case was Lucius Lawless, a man with a reputation that, according to Harney's biographer George Raleigh Adams, gave Harney comfort. The trial took place in the spring of 1835. 15 witnesses testified, but their testimony went unrecorded. No transcript was made. And when it was over, despite the coroner's ruling, despite the grand jury indictment, despite the obvious fact that William Harney had beaten Hannah to death, the jury acquitted him. The acquittal reflected the legal and social realities of slavery in antebellum America. Enslaved people were property. Harney had destroyed his own property, or rather property that he had acquired through his wife. In the eyes of the law, this was not so different from a man destroying his own furniture or killing his own livestock. The value of an enslaved woman's life was measured in dollars and cents, not in justice or humanity. And so William S. Harney walked free, his military career intact, his reputation among his fellow officers undamaged. What makes Hannah's death even more significant is that it was not an isolated incident. Harney's brutality toward enslaved people was a pattern, not an aberration. According to accounts from the National Park Service and other historical sources, Harney owned a group of muscular male slaves, whom he enjoyed provoking into fistfights with soldiers known for brawling. He treated violence as entertainment, using enslaved human beings as gladiators for his own amusement. This was the character of the man who would go on to command armies, negotiate treaties, and shape the destiny of nations. After his acquittal, Harney returned to active military duty as if nothing had happened. In 1835, the Second Seminole War broke out in Florida, a conflict between the United States government and the Seminole people over the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. Harney was given a command, and he threw himself into the campaign with the same violent energy he had displayed in his treatment of Hannah. The Seminole War would last until 1842, becoming the longest and most expensive of all the Indian wars fought by the United States. For Harney, it became a crucible that shaped his approach to warfare and his reputation for ruthlessness. In July 1839, Harney was commanding a trading post on the Caloosahatchee River near present-day Fort Myers when disaster struck. A band of approximately 150 Seminole warriors, led by a leader named Chakaika, launched a surprise attack at dawn. The assault killed 18 Americans, including soldiers and civilians. Harney himself barely escaped, fleeing in his nightclothes after fighting hand-to-hand with the attackers. For Harney, The attack was a personal humiliation, and he vowed vengeance. He spent the following months training his men in swamp and jungle warfare, preparing for a punitive expedition into the Everglades, a vast wilderness that no American military force had successfully penetrated. In December 1840, Harney led 90 men into the Everglades from Fort Dallas on the Miami River. They traveled in canoes borrowed from the Marines, navigating through sawgrass and swamp in pursuit of their quarry. What happened next reveals much about William Harney's character. To guide his expedition, Harney needed someone who knew the Everglades, someone who could lead him to Chakaika's hidden camp. He found that guide in an enslaved black man named John, who had been held captive by the Seminoles. Harney promised John his freedom in exchange for his assistance, a promise that raises troubling questions about the nature of freedom in a world built on bondage. When John had difficulty finding the way, Harney tried to force captured Seminole women to lead them to the camp, reportedly by threatening to hang their children. This was not an idle threat. Harney had already demonstrated his willingness to use extreme violence against women, and the Seminole captives had every reason to believe he would follow through. Eventually, John regained his bearings, and the expedition found Chakaika's camp. Harney's soldiers, dressed as Native Americans to achieve surprise, approached the camp in the early morning hours. Chakaika was outside when the attack began. He started to run, then stopped and turned to face the soldiers, offering his hand in what may have been a gesture of surrender. One of the soldiers shot and killed him anyway. A brief fight ensued, during which some of the Seminoles escaped. But Harney was not satisfied with Chakaika's death. He ordered 2 of the captured warriors hanged immediately, their bodies strung up from the trees. Then he had Chakaika's body hung beside them, a grim display of American power. The expedition killed 4 Seminoles in the fighting and hanged 5 more in summary executions. These were not deaths in battle. They were executions, carried out without trial, without due process, without any pretense of legality. The response in the American press was largely positive. The St. Augustine Times praised Harney as a man who knew his duty to country and was not afraid to perform it. The Florida Territorial Legislature presented him with a commendation and a ceremonial sword. Harney was promoted to command of the 2nd Dragoons, his career trajectory unimpeded by the violence he had inflicted on both enslaved people and indigenous peoples. But Harney's brutality was not reserved for those he considered enemies. His treatment of his own soldiers was often harsh to the point of cruelty. In 1844, while commanding Fort Washita in Oklahoma, Harney demonstrated this vividly. When 2 enlisted men, J.H. O'Brien and Private Sylvanus Bean, refused orders to dig a latrine and insulted their commanding officer, Harney's response was extreme. He grabbed O'Brien by the hair, threw him to the ground, and beat him with his cane so severely that O'Brien spent a week in the infirmary. Bean received even harsher treatment. Harney ordered him shackled with a ball and chain and fitted with a spiked collar, which he was forced to wear during 27 days of hard labor. These incidents led other officers to complain that Harney's arbitrary and unmilitary conduct was not in keeping with good order and military discipline. Harney was court-martialed in June 1845. He defended himself by claiming he was merely naturally boisterous while serving his country to the best of his abilities. He was convicted and sentenced to a 4-month suspension, but General Winfield Scott, the highest-ranking officer in the United States military, suspended the sentence because he thought it was not sufficient punishment for what he called Harney's vicious assault. The Mexican-American War began in 1846, and Harney was given a frontline command despite his history of violence and insubordination. Almost immediately, he demonstrated why his superiors had reason for concern. Harney disobeyed direct orders, crossing the Rio Grande and attacking Mexican forces before other American troops had assembled. He was court-martialed again, found guilty of disobeying direct orders, and once again escaped punishment. President James K. Polk overrode the judgment of Harney's superiors, concluding that Harney's only fault was being a member of the Democratic Party. During the Mexican-American War, Harney earned accolades for his bravery in combat. He fought with distinction at the Battle of Cerro Gordo and was promoted to brevet brigadier general. But it was in the final days of the war that Harney would commit what many consider his most disturbing acts. The St. Patrick's Battalion, known as the San Patricios, was a unit of the Mexican Army composed primarily of Irish immigrants and other Catholic Europeans who had deserted from the United States Army. Many of these men had experienced religious discrimination and brutal treatment at the hands of American officers, and they had switched sides to fight for Mexico. The Mexican government had actively recruited Catholic immigrants in the American Army, distributing handbills that urged them not to fight against a religious people, and warned them not to be seen in the ranks of those who proclaim slavery of mankind as a constitutive principle. For Irish immigrants who had fled the oppression of British rule and the devastation of the Great Famine, the appeal was powerful. They were being asked to fight for a Protestant nation that treated them as second-class citizens against a Catholic nation that promised them land and respect. The San Patricios fought bravely and well throughout the Mexican-American War, earning the respect of their Mexican comrades and the burning hatred of their former American commanders. At the Battle of Monterrey in September 1846, they defeated American forces in 3 separate engagements. At the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847, they performed with such distinction that official reports stated they were worthy of the most consummate praise because the men fought with daring bravery. They designed their own battle flag, a green banner with a gold harp at the center, surrounded by shamrocks and bearing the words Erin go Bragh, meaning Ireland forever. For the American officers who faced them across the battlefield, the San Patricios represented the ultimate betrayal, and men like William Harney were determined to make them pay. In August 1847, at the Battle of Churubusco on the outskirts of Mexico City, the San Patricios were finally defeated. They had been ordered to protect a fortified bridgehead and a Franciscan convent, and they fought with desperate courage, knowing that capture meant death. When their fellow Mexican troops tried to raise a white flag of surrender, the San Patricios reportedly tore it down, unwilling to give up as long as they had ammunition to fire. Only when all hope was lost did they finally surrender. 80 members of the battalion were captured, and they were tried as deserters in hastily convened courts-martial. The trials were held just 3 and 6 days after capture. The accused were denied legal counsel. No transcripts were made. 50 men were sentenced to death. The proceedings were carefully managed by General Winfield Scott, who intended to make an example of these men. Several of the condemned received pardons due to their relatively young age. One man was pardoned because evidence showed he had not deserted voluntarily, but had been kidnapped by the Mexicans while drunk. John Riley, the Irish leader of the battalion, was spared the gallows because he had deserted before the war officially began. Instead, he was sentenced to 50 lashes on his bare back and had the letter D branded on his cheek to mark him forever as a deserter. he later grew a beard to hide the scars. General Winfield Scott divided the executions into 3 groups. 16 men were hanged at San Angelo on September 10, 1847. But the most spectacular and brutal executions were reserved for September 13th, the day of the Battle of Chapultepec, the final major engagement of the war. Scott ordered that 30 San Patricios be executed at the precise moment that the American flag replaced the Mexican flag atop Chapultepec Castle. And he assigned William S. Harney to carry out this order. What followed was a display of deliberate cruelty that shocked even those accustomed to the brutalities of war. At dawn on September 13th, Harney had the 30 condemned men brought forward. They were placed in mule-driven wagons with nooses around their necks. Then Harney made them wait. He made them stand there, bound hand and foot, ropes around their necks, watching the battle unfold in the distance. For nearly 4 hours they stood in us, the burning Mexican sun, waiting to die. The condemned men taunted Harney. They jeered at him. One Irish soldier reportedly shouted that they would not be hanged until the dirty old flag flew over the castle, implying confidence that the Americans would fail. But at 9:30 in the morning, the American flag rose over Chapultepec. At that moment, Harney gave the order and the wagons were pulled away. 30 men died simultaneously, their bodies jerking at the end of their ropes as both armies watched. One of those men was Francis O'Connor, who had lost both legs in battle just the day before. When the army surgeon informed Harney that O'Connor could not walk to his own execution, Harney's response was chilling. "Bring the damned son of a bitch out," he reportedly said. "My order was to hang 30, and by God, I will do it." And so Francis O'Connor, a man who had already lost his legs fighting for what he believed in, was carried to the gallows and hanged. After the executions, Harney left the bodies to rot on the gallows as a warning to the residents of Mexico City. The Mexican government condemned the hangings as cruel deaths and horrible torments, improper in a civilized age. Mexican newspapers called the Americans barbarians. But in the United States, Harney was celebrated as a hero, a man who had dealt appropriately with traitors and deserters. The San Patricios are still honored as heroes in Mexico. Every year, on September 12th, Mexico pays tribute to them at San Jacinto Plaza in Mexico City. A memorial plaque describes them as martyrs who gave their lives for the cause of Mexico during the unjust United States invasion of 1847. At the bottom of the plaque, one line captures the Mexican perspective on what Harney did that day. With the gratitude of Mexico, 112 years after their Holocaust. After the Mexican-American War, Harney continued his career of violence against Native American peoples. In 1854, while on leave in Paris, he was recalled by the United States government to lead a punitive expedition against the Sioux. The previous year, a minor dispute over a stray cow had escalated into what became known as the Grattan Massacre, in which Sioux warriors killed Lieutenant John Grattan and 29 of his soldiers near Fort Laramie. President Franklin Pierce vowed revenge, and the War Department appointed Harney to command the expedition with explicit instructions to whip the Indians. On September 3, 1855, Harney's 600-man force caught up with a Sioux encampment along Blue Water Creek near Ash Hollow in present-day Nebraska. The force included elements of the 2nd Dragoons, the 6th and 10th Infantry Regiments, and artillery support. They had marched approximately 250 miles from Fort Kearny over 10 days, navigating arid grasslands plagued by extreme summer heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Harney enforced rigorous discipline during the march, including prohibitions on straggling, campfires at night, and unnecessary noise to minimize signs of the force's aggressive intent and evade early detection by Lakota scouts. The camp they found belonged to a band of Brule Lakota, led by Chief Little Thunder, who had succeeded the slain conquering bear. There were between 250 and 400 Sioux in the encampment, including warriors, women, children, and elders. Harney sent a regiment on a long night flanking maneuver to set up a blocking position. The flanking force was led by Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook and Captain Henry Heth, who would later serve as a Confederate general in the Civil War. Harney moved up in the morning to drive the Sioux against his troops. He attempted to parley with Little Thunder, but his demands to hand over the men responsible for the Grattan attack were rebuffed. Little Thunder reportedly believed that the talks were genuine, that negotiations might prevent bloodshed. He was wrong. What happened next has been called both a battle and a massacre, depending on who is telling the story. Lakota oral histories describe the engagement as a surprise attack on a peaceful camp. Harney ordered his infantry to attack the Sioux camp at dawn. The infantry opened fire and forced the Sioux toward the mounted soldiers, who had circled around to cut off their escape. Some of the Sioux took refuge in caves along the river, seeking shelter from the gunfire. Harney had his men fire into the caves, killing many women and children who had sought shelter there. A group of mounted warriors tried to escape, but they were pursued by cavalry for about 5 miles in a running fight that lasted several hours. Captain Heth led the pursuit so aggressively that at one point he got so far ahead of his men that he was presumed killed in action. His death was reported in newspapers around the country, and he later took satisfaction in reading the obituaries his friends had written for him. When the shooting stopped, at least 86 Lakota lay dead or dying. Initial reports stated that number, but the totals were later determined to be higher as additional casualties were found in the following days. Nearly half of the dead were women and children. Another 70 women and children were taken prisoner. The Sioux teepees were looted and burned by Harney's troops, destroying the food, clothing, and shelter the survivors would need to survive the coming winter. Among the American participants in the battle was a young officer named Gouverneur K. Warren, who would later become a Union general during the Civil War. Warren noted in his diary the horror of killing women and children. The New York Times called the engagement a massacre and described the killings as outright butchery. The Sioux gave Harney a new name after Blue Water Creek. They called him Woman Killer. They also called him Mad Bear. These were not terms of respect. They were descriptions of a man who had shown no mercy to women, children, or the elderly. A man who had killed indiscriminately and without restraint. The name, Woman Killer, would follow Harney for the rest of his life and beyond. In the aftermath of the battle, Harney marched his forces through the heart of Sioux country, from Fort Laramie to Fort Pierre on the Missouri River. The Sioux offered no further resistance. The following year, without authorization to do so, Harney negotiated a peace treaty with the Sioux, requiring them to form a centralized tribal government by which he could hold leaders accountable for the actions of individual bands. It was an attempt to impose European-style governance on a people whose political structures were fundamentally different. Harney continued to serve in various capacities throughout the 1850s. He commanded the Department of Oregon from 1858 to 1860, during which time he nearly started a war with Great Britain over the disputed San Juan Islands in what became known as the Pig War. His aggressive actions forced his recall by his superiors. He briefly commanded troops during the Utah War, and was sent to deal with the guerrilla warfare of Bleeding, Kansas. In each assignment, his pattern of aggressive, often reckless behavior continued. When the Civil War began in 1861, Harney was in command of the Army's Department of the West, based at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. Despite his Tennessee birth and his slaveholding background, he chose to remain loyal to the Union. But his loyalty was always suspect. His wife's family was prominent in St. Louis, and many of them had Southern sympathies. When Captain Nathaniel Lyon captured a force of pro-Confederate state militia in what became known as the Camp Jackson affair, Harney was horrified by the resulting violence. Harney attempted to negotiate a compromise. He signed the Price-Harney Truce with Sterling Price, commander of the Missouri State Guard, agreeing that federal troops would stay near St. Louis while the State Guard controlled most of Missouri. Governor Claiborne Jackson, who favored secession, swore allegiance to the Union as part of the deal. But Unionist leaders in Missouri were outraged. They saw the truce as capitulation to Confederate sympathizers, and they questioned Harney's loyalty. Harney was recalled to Washington to explain himself. On the way, he was captured by Confederate forces at Harper's Ferry and offered a command by Robert E. Lee. He refused and was released to continue on to Washington. But by then, his career was effectively over. He was relieved of command and replaced by Nathaniel Lyon. President Lincoln later said that the removal of General Harney was one of the greatest mistakes of his administration, but by then it was too late. Harney retired from active service in 1863 and was breveted to Major General in 1865 in recognition of his long career. After the war, he served on the Indian Peace Commission under President Andrew Johnson, negotiating treaties with the Plains tribes. It was a strange role for a man the Sioux knew as woman killer, but Harney seemed to genuinely believe that he was working for peace. He spent his final years partly in Missouri and partly in Mississippi, where he traded reminiscences with both Jefferson Davis and Ulysses S. Grant. He died on May 9, 1889, in Orlando, Florida, at the age of 88. William S. Harney lived a long life. He served his country for nearly 50 years, from 1818 to 1863. He was honored with promotions, commendations, and ceremonial swords. A peak in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the highest point in the state at 7,242 feet, was named after him in 1857, following his campaigns in the region. A county in eastern Oregon, encompassing over 10,000 square miles and established on February 23, 1889, just months before his death, still bears his name today. For much of American history, he was remembered as a hero, a tough frontier soldier who helped tame the West and expand the boundaries of the United States. The commemorations continued long after his death. His summer home in Sullivan, Missouri, was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Military histories praised his courage and his contributions to American expansion. The brutal incidents that marked his career were minimized, explained away, or simply forgotten. Hannah's death was a minor footnote, if it was mentioned at all. The massacre at Blue Water Creek was reframed as a legitimate military engagement. The hanging of the San Patricios was portrayed as the justified punishment of traitors. But history has a way of revealing what was hidden. Descendants of the people Harney harmed have kept their memories alive. Lakota oral histories have preserved the story of what happened at Blue Water Creek, passing it down through generations as a warning about the violence of colonization. Mexican communities continue to honor the San Patricios as heroes who died fighting against American imperialism. Scholars have uncovered the records of Hannah's death, piecing together the story of an enslaved woman whose life was cut short by a man who faced no real consequences for killing her. In 2016, more than 160 years after the massacre at Blue Water Creek, the United States Board on Geographic Names voted to rename Harney Peak. It is now called Black Elk Peak, in honor of the Oglala Lakota holy man Nicholas Black Elk, who experienced a vision atop that mountain as a child. The renaming was a small act of justice, a recognition that the man whose name once graced that summit was not worthy of the honor. The decision specifically addressed Harney's legacy of leading punitive expeditions against Native Americans, including what the board acknowledged as the 1855 Ash Hollow Massacre, where his troops killed at least 86 Lakota, many of them non-combatants. What does it mean to remember William S. Harney? It means remembering Hannah, the young enslaved woman who lost her life over a set of keys. It means remembering the Seminole warriors who were hanged without trial, their bodies displayed as trophies. It means remembering Francis O'Connor, who lost his legs and then his life to a man who would not be denied his quota of death. It means remembering the women and children of Blue Water Creek, who died in caves along the riverbank while American soldiers fired into the darkness. Harney's story is not just the story of one violent man. It is the story of a system that enabled him, that rewarded him, that elevated him to positions of power and authority despite overwhelming evidence of his brutality. He beat an enslaved woman to death and was acquitted. He executed prisoners without trial and was promoted. He killed women and children and was given command of larger armies. At every turn, the institutions of American power protected him, excused him, celebrated him. The people Harney harmed have largely been forgotten by history. We do not know Hannah's last name. We do not know where she was buried or if she was buried at all. The Lakota women and children who died at Blue Water Creek are remembered by their descendants, but their names appear in no official American records. The San Patricios are honored in Mexico, but in the United States they are largely unknown except to specialists and historians. This is the work of historical memory. It is not enough to know what happened. We must understand what it meant and what it continues to mean. William S. Harney was not an aberration. He was a product of his time and his culture, a man who absorbed the values of a society built on slavery and conquest, and who carried those values to their logical conclusions. The violence he inflicted was not despite his status as an American officer and gentleman. It was because of it. Today, we have a choice about how we remember men like William S. Harney. We can continue to honor them with monuments and place names, or we can choose to tell the truth about what they did. We can continue to celebrate the conquest of the American West as a heroic achievement, or we can acknowledge that it was built on the bodies of enslaved people, indigenous peoples, and anyone else who stood in the way of expansion. The renaming of Harney Peak was a beginning, not an end. There are still places across America that bear the names of slaveholders, Indian killers, and perpetrators of violence. Each of those names is a choice, a statement about who we are and who we want to be. The question is not whether we can change the past. The past is what it was. The question is whether we can learn from it, whether we can build a future that does not repeat its mistakes. William S. Harney died in 1889, comfortable and honored, surrounded by friends who remembered him as a great man. He had spent his final years in relative comfort, living partly in Missouri and partly in Mississippi, where he traded reminiscences with both Jefferson Davis, his old friend from the Black Hawk War who had gone on to lead the Confederacy, and Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who had crushed that same Confederacy. That Harney could count both men as friends speaks to his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of American politics, to remain respected despite the controversies that followed him throughout his career. Hannah died in 1834, beaten to death by a man who faced no real consequences for killing her. She was young, perhaps still in her 20s. She was a mother. She had a name, but history has not preserved her surname. We do not know where she was buried, if she was buried at all. The child she left behind disappeared into the historical record, their fate unknown. Hannah's death was not unique. Countless enslaved people died at the hands of their owners, their deaths unrecorded and unmourned by the society that profited from their labor. But Hannah's death was documented, investigated, and ultimately excused by the legal system that claimed to provide justice for all. Between those two deaths lies the entire history of America's relationship with power, race, and violence. It is a history we are still living with today, and it is a history that demands to be remembered.